The gunshot echoed across the dusty main street of Redemption Springs, shattering the quiet Sunday morning like a hammer striking glass. Margaret Winters pressed her back against the rough wood of the church door, her heart pounding wildly in her chest, the taste of fear metallic on her tongue. The white lace of her Sunday dress was stained with the red dust of Arizona Territory, her carefully arranged blonde hair now falling in disarray around her flushed face. Outside, men shouted and horses whinnied in panic. Another shot rang out, closer this time, causing her to flinch. She hadn't expected her first Sunday in this frontier town to end with her cowering behind a church door, praying for salvation. The sound of spurs jingling against wooden steps made her breath catch. A shadow fell across the gap beneath the door. Margaret pressed deeper into the corner, making herself as small as possible, clutching her small leather-bound Bible to her chest like a shield. "Miss," a deep voice called out softly, "I know you're in there. It's safe to step out now." Margaret remained frozen, unsure if she could trust the stranger. The gunfire had stopped, but that didn't mean the danger had passed. "Miss," the voice came again, gentle but insistent, "the Blackwell gang's moved on. You don't need to hide anymore." Gathering what little courage she had left, Margaret slowly stood, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. She took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy wooden door. Standing on the church steps was a tall man with broad shoulders, the sun at his back casting his face in shadow. As her eyes adjusted, she could make out his features' strong jaw darkened with several days' worth of stubble, piercing blue eyes, and a shock of dark hair visible beneath a well-worn Stetson. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, dusty denims, a faded blue shirt, leather vest, and chaps that had seen better days. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, his gaze quickly assessing her for injuries. "No," Margaret managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just frightened." The cowboy nodded, the corners of his mouth turning up slightly in what might have been a smile. "Name's Matthew Riley. Most folks call me Matt." He touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "And you would be?" "Margaret Winters," she replied, still clutching her Bible tightly. "I arrived on yesterday's stage from Boston." "Boston?" Matt raised an eyebrow. "That's a mighty long way from Redemption Springs." "I've come to teach at the school," Margaret explained, finally finding her voice. "I was told this was a peaceful town." A grimace crossed Matt's face. "It usually is. The Blackwell boys don't often come this far north. Bad timing on their part and yours." Margaret took a tentative step forward. "What happened?" "Bank robbery gone wrong," Matt explained, offering his arm to help her down the steps. They didn't count on the new sheriff being in the bank at the time, turned into a shootout. Margaret hesitantly placed her hand on his offered arm, noticing the rough texture of his shirt beneath her fingers. "Is anyone hurt?" "Two of the gang won't be robbing any more banks," Matt said grimly. "Sheriff took a bullet in the shoulder, but Doc Wallace says he'll make it. No townsfolk hurt, thank the Lord." As they descended the church steps, Margaret could see people emerging from buildings all along the street, looking cautiously around like prairie dogs checking for predators. A crowd was gathering outside the bank, and several men were loading bodies onto a wagon. "I should probably see you home," Matt said, guiding her away from the grim scene. "Where are you staying?" "Mrs. Holloway's boarding house," Margaret replied, suddenly feeling lightheaded. The reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. She swayed slightly, Matt's hand moved to her elbow, steadying her. "Easy now," he said softly. "First gunfight's always the hardest." Margaret looked up at him, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. "You speak as if there will be more." "This is still frontier country, Miss Winters," Matt said, his voice neither apologetic nor boastful, simply stating a fact. "But don't let today color your impression too much. Redemption Springs is mostly good people trying to build something worthwhile." As they walked down the dusty street toward the boarding house, Margaret became acutely aware of the curious glances thrown their way. A tall woman in a practical dress emerged from the general store, her eyebrows rising at the sight of Matt escorting the new schoolteacher. "That's Mrs. Peterson," Matt explained in a low voice. "Wife of the mayor. Nothing happens in this town she doesn't know about." And now she knows about me, Margaret said, feeling uncomfortable under the woman's scrutiny. By supper time, everyone will know how you bravely hid in the church during the shootout and how I gallantly rescued you, Matt said with a slight chuckle. Is that what happened? Margaret asked, finding herself smiling despite everything. Well, it sounds better than she cowered in fear and I stated the obvious, Matt replied, his blue eyes twinkling with good humor. For the first time since the gunshots had shattered her peaceful Sunday morning, Margaret felt herself relax slightly. There was something reassuring about this tall cowboy with his easy manner and watchful eyes. They reached the boarding house, a 2-story clapboard building with a wide front porch and neatly tended flower boxes. Mrs. Holloway, a plump woman in her 50s with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, burst through the front door before they'd even reached the steps. Miss Winters, she exclaimed, rushing forward. We were so worried. When the shooting started and you weren't here, she broke off, noticing Matt for the first time. Mr. Riley, she acknowledged with a nod that was decidedly cooler. Mrs. Holloway, Matt tipped his hat. Found Miss Winters taking shelter in the church. Thought I'd see her safely home. How thoughtful of you, Mrs. Holloway said, in a tone that suggested she found it anything but. She turned to Margaret. Come inside, dear. You look positively piqued. I'll make you some tea. Margaret turned to Matt, suddenly reluctant to part from the one person who had shown her kindness on this terrifying day. Thank you, Mr. Riley. I'm in your debt. Matt shook his head. No debt, Miss Winters, just doing what anyone would do. He touched the brim of his hat again. Welcome to Redemption Springs. I hope your next Sunday is considerably less exciting. As Mrs. Holloway ushered her inside with a firm hand on her back, Margaret looked over her shoulder at the cowboy. He stood for a moment, watching her go, before turning and walking back toward the center of town, his spurs jingling with each step. That man, Mrs. Holloway said disapprovingly as she closed the front door, is trouble, Miss Winters. Best you remember that. Margaret said nothing, but as she followed her landlady to the kitchen, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of trouble a man could be who would check a church for frightened strangers during a gunfight. The next morning, Margaret rose early, determined not to let the previous day's events interfere with her first day of teaching. She dressed carefully in her best navy blue skirt and crisp white shirtwaist, pinning her hair in a neat bun at the nape of her neck. The looking glass reflected a young woman of 24 with clear gray eyes and a determined set to her chin. You came west to make a difference, she told her reflection. One shootout isn't going to send you scurrying back to Boston, Mrs. Holloway had prepared a hearty breakfast of flapjacks and bacon, which Margaret ate with more appetite than she expected. The other boarders, an elderly widower named Mr. Perkins, and a young bank clerk called Thomas, had already left for the day. The schoolhouse is just 3 blocks down and 1 over, Mrs. Holloway explained as Margaret prepared to leave. You can't miss it, only building in town with a bell tower besides the church. Thank you, Margaret said, gathering her books and the lunch Mrs. Holloway had packed for her. I appreciate all your kindness. The older woman's face softened. This is a good town, Miss Winters, despite what you saw yesterday. The Blackwell gang, that's not Redemption Springs. That's the dying gasp of the lawless frontier. Margaret nodded, touched by the woman's evident love for her community. I believe you, Mrs. Holloway, and I'm looking forward to becoming part of it. The morning was bright and clear, the air already warming with the promise of another hot September day. As Margaret walked down the main street, she was struck by how normal everything appeared. If not for the fresh boards covering a shattered window at the bank, one would never know that violence had erupted here just yesterday. People nodded and greeted her as she passed. Some she recognized from church the previous morning before the shooting started. Others were new faces, curious about the Boston lady who had come to teach their children. The schoolhouse was indeed easy to find, a simple one-room building painted white, with a small bell tower and a flagpole out front. A yard surrounded by a picket fence contained a well and several crude swings hanging from the branches of a large cottonwood tree. As Margaret approached, she saw children of various ages already gathering in the yard, watched over by a tall, gray-haired man who could only be the mayor. Beside him stood Mrs. Peterson, wearing the same disapproving expression she'd worn when seeing Margaret with Matt Riley. "Ah, Miss Winters." The man called out cheerfully as she approached. "Right on time, I'm Albert Peterson, mayor of Redemption Springs." He pumped her hand enthusiastically. "This is my wife, Harriet." "Pleased to meet you both," Margaret said, smiling at the children who were now watching her with undisguised curiosity. She counted 15 of them, ranging in age from about 6 to perhaps 14 or 15. "We're mighty grateful you answered our advertisement," Mayor Peterson continued. "Been without a proper teacher since Miss Henderson left us to get married last spring." "I'm looking forward to getting started," Margaret said. "Should we ring the bell?" The mayor beamed. "Indeed we should. Children, line up now. Let's show Miss Winters how we do things in Redemption Springs." The children obediently formed 2 lines, boys on one side, girls on the other, while Mayor Peterson solemnly handed Margaret a small brass bell. She rang it firmly, feeling a sense of rightness as the clear tone rang out across the schoolyard. "School is now in session," she announced, and led the way into her new classroom. The day passed in a blur of introductions, assessments, and establishing routines. The children were, for the most part, eager to learn and respectful, though there were a few troublemakers, particularly among the older boys who clearly resented having to attend school at all. One boy in particular, Jack Webster, the 13-year-old son of a local rancher, seemed determined to test her authority at every turn. By the end of the day, Margaret was exhausted but satisfied. She had survived her first day of teaching in the West. As she was gathering her things to leave, a knock at the door made her look up. Standing in the doorway, hat in hand, was Matthew Riley. "Mr. Riley," she said, surprised, "what brings you to the schoolhouse?" "Thought I'd check on how your first day went," he said, stepping inside but remaining near the door as if unsure of his welcome. "Folks can be pretty curious about newcomers." "So I noticed," Margaret said, closing her lesson book. "I've been asked about everything from my journey west to my marriageable status." Matt chuckled. "That would be Mrs. Peterson's doing. She's appointed herself matchmaker for the county." "Then she'll be disappointed in me," Margaret said firmly. "I didn't come west to find a husband. I came to teach." Something flickered in Matt's eyes, amusement perhaps, or approval. "Fair enough, but that won't stop her from trying." Margaret finished gathering her things and walked toward the door. Matt stepped aside to let her pass, then followed her outside, waiting as she locked the schoolhouse door. "I also came to warn you," he said, his voice dropping lower. "The Blackwell gang, there were 5 of them, but only 2 were killed. The others got away." Margaret felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. "Do you think they'll come back?" "Maybe. Sheriff Daniels wired the territorial marshal. They're sending men, but until then..." He hesitated. "Just be careful. Don't go wandering outside town alone." "I appreciate the warning," Margaret said, touched by his concern, "though I don't make a habit of wandering in the wilderness." Matt smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Good to know. Can I walk you back to Mrs. Holloway's?" Margaret hesitated, remembering the landlady's warning about Matt being trouble. But his concern seemed genuine, and after the fright of the previous day, she found his solid presence reassuring. "That would be kind of you," she said finally. They walked in companionable silence for a few moments before Margaret's curiosity got the better of her. "Mrs. Holloway seemed less than pleased to see you yesterday," she ventured. Matt's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Mrs. Holloway thinks I'm a bad influence. She hasn't forgiven me for the time I took her nephew fishing instead of letting him attend Sunday school." "That hardly seems worthy of permanent disapproval," Margaret observed. "Well, there was also the matter of the saloon brawl last Christmas," Matt admitted. "And the horse race down Main Street during Founders' Day celebrations." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "I see. Perhaps Mrs. Holloway has a point." "I never claimed to be a saint, Miss Winters," Matt said, his tone light but his eyes watching her reaction carefully. "But I'm not the devil she makes me out to be, either." They had reached the boarding house. Matt stopped at the gate, not making any move to accompany her to the door. "Thank you for the escort, Mr." Riley, Margaret said formally, aware that they were likely being observed from behind the lace curtains. My pleasure, Miss Winters, he replied, touching the brim of his hat. If you need anything, I work at the Lazy R Ranch just north of town. Anyone can point you in the right direction. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Margaret to face Mrs. Holloway's inevitable questions about why she was once again in the company of Matthew Riley. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern. Margaret would teach during the day, prepare lessons in the evening, and attend church on Sundays. She gradually got to know the townspeople, the blacksmith and his wife, who had lost 3 children to fever before moving west, the shopkeeper who had fought for the Union and still walked with a limp from a Confederate bullet, the young widow who ran the millinery shop and cared for her aging father. She saw Matt Riley occasionally riding through town on ranch business, drinking coffee at the hotel restaurant, or attending Sunday services. Each time he would tip his hat and inquire after her well-being, but he never again offered to walk her home. Margaret told herself she was relieved, given Mrs. Holloway's obvious disapproval, but she found herself watching for him nonetheless. September gave way to October, bringing cooler temperatures and the golden light of autumn. The children in Margaret's school were making progress. Even young Jack Webster, who had finally stopped challenging her at every turn once he discovered she was willing to let him read adventure stories if he completed his arithmetic. One Friday afternoon, as Margaret was dismissing the children, Mayor Peterson appeared at the schoolhouse door. "Miss Winters," he called, "a moment of your time, if you please." Margaret nodded, puzzled by his serious expression. "Of course, Mayor, children, you're dismissed." "Jack, don't forget your composition is due Monday." As the children filed out, Mayor Peterson entered, twisting his hat in his hands. "Miss Winters, I'm afraid I have some disturbing news. The territorial marshal wired this morning. The remaining Blackwell gang members have been spotted less than 50 miles from here." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "I see. Do they think the gang is heading this way?" "It's possible," the mayor said grimly. "The marshal believes they might try to break their partner out of our jail. Or worse, seek revenge for their fallen comrades." "What should we do?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sheriff Daniels is organizing a town meeting tonight at the hotel. We'll discuss preparations." He paused. "In the meantime, I'd advise you to be extra cautious. Perhaps stay close to the boarding house this weekend." Margaret nodded, her thoughts racing. "I'll be at the meeting, Mayor. Thank you for warning me." After the mayor left, Margaret sat at her desk for a long moment, trying to calm her racing heart. The memory of gunshots and the terror of hiding behind the church door came flooding back. She had believed that danger was past, that she was settling into her new life. Now it seemed the violence of her first day might return. With a deep breath, she gathered her things and left the schoolhouse, locking the door carefully behind her. The walk to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house had never seemed so long, though it was barely 4 blocks. Every shadow, every sudden movement made her jump. As she rounded the corner onto Pine Street, she nearly collided with a tall figure. "Miss Winters," Matt Riley said, steadying her with a hand on her arm. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Mr. Riley," Margaret said, relief flooding through her at the sight of his familiar face. "I just heard about the Blackwell gang." Matt's expression grew serious. "So the news is out. I was in the sheriff's office when the wire came. That's why I'm in town. The ranch hands are taking turns standing guard at night." "The mayor mentioned a town meeting tonight," Margaret said. Matt nodded. 8 o'clock at the hotel. Will you be there?" "Yes," Margaret said firmly. "This is my home now. I want to help protect it." Something like approval flashed in Matt's eyes. Most newcomers would be packing their bags at the first sign of trouble. "I'm not most newcomers," Margaret replied, lifting her chin slightly. "No," Matt agreed softly. "You certainly are not." He glanced down the street. "May I walk with you? I'd feel better knowing you got home safely." Margaret nodded, not caring what Mrs. Holloway might think. The threat of the Blackwell gang overshadowed any concern about town gossip. They walked in silence for a few moments, both lost in thought. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Mr. Riley, Matt," he interrupted. "If we're going to face outlaws together, you might as well use my Christian name." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Margaret felt a smile tug at her lips. "Matt, then, and I'm Margaret." "Margaret," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "What were you going to ask? How dangerous are these men, truly?" The mayor seemed very concerned. Matt's face hardened. "The Blackwell brothers are not men to take lightly. They've robbed banks across 3 territories, killed at least 5 men that we know of, and now they're out for blood." Margaret shivered despite the warm afternoon. "What will happen at the meeting tonight?" "Sheriff will organize volunteers for additional patrols, probably ask the women and children to stay close to home for a few days." He glanced at her. "You should consider staying with a family rather than at the boarding house, safety in numbers." Mrs. Holloway and Mr. Perkins are hardly defenseless, Margaret protested, "and I won't be driven from my home by fear." They had reached the boarding house. Matt stopped at the gate, much as he had that first day. "Stubborn as well as brave," he observed. "Be careful, Margaret. I'd hate to see anything happen to you." The simple statement, delivered in his matter-of-fact way, warmed her more than she cared to admit. "I will be, and you as well, Matt." He touched the brim of his hat and turned to go, then paused. "I'll come by at 7:45 to escort you to the meeting." "No arguments," he added as she opened her mouth to protest. "Not with the Blackwells potentially in the area." Margaret closed her mouth, nodded once, and watched as he strode away down the street, his spurs jingling with each step. That evening, promptly at 7:45, Matt appeared at the boarding house door. He had changed into a clean shirt and his best denims, Margaret noticed, and had even trimmed his beard. Mrs. Holloway greeted him with slightly less frost than usual, the gravity of the town's situation apparently overriding her personal disapproval. "I'll have her home directly after the meeting, madam," Matt promised, his hat in his hands. "See that you do," Mrs. Holloway replied. "These are dangerous times, Mr. Riley." "Yes, madam, they surely are," Matt agreed solemnly. The hotel's dining room was packed when they arrived, nearly every adult in Redemption Springs crammed into the space. Sheriff Daniels, his arm still in a sling from the bullet wound he'd received during the bank robbery, stood at the front of the room with Mayor Peterson. Matt guided Margaret to seats near the back, nodding to several men as they passed. Margaret noticed that many of the townspeople seemed to regard Matt with a mixture of respect and wariness, much as they might view a useful but potentially dangerous tool. "Folks, settle down now," Sheriff Daniels called, his voice cutting through the anxious chatter. "We've got important business to discuss." The room gradually quieted. "As most of you have heard by now, we have reason to believe the remaining Blackwell gang members may be heading this way," the sheriff continued. "Territorial Marshal wired this morning that they were spotted in Dry Creek 2 days ago, which puts them about 2 days' ride from here." A murmur ran through the crowd. "Now they might pass us by," the sheriff said, raising his hand for quiet, "but we need to be prepared in case they don't. Mayor Peterson and I have worked out a plan." For the next half hour, the sheriff outlined the town's defenses: additional men to patrol the streets, designated safe houses where women and children could gather if trouble started, a signal system using the church bell. "What about the prisoner?" someone called out. "Ain't the Blackwells likely to try and free him?" Sheriff Daniels nodded grimly. "That's my thinking too, which is why I've asked for volunteers to help guard the jail." Several men raised their hands, including Matt. Margaret felt a stab of concern as she watched him volunteer for what was clearly the most dangerous assignment. "Thank you, gentlemen," the sheriff said. "We'll set up a rotation, 2 men on duty at all times, 8-hour shifts." The meeting continued with various assignments being handed out. Margaret was asked to help Mrs. Peterson organize supplies for the safe houses, food, water, and medical necessities in case of a prolonged situation. "Any questions?" Mayor Peterson asked finally. A woman near the front raised her hand. "How long do we need to live like this?" "My children are frightened," the sheriff sighed. "The territorial marshal is sending men, but they're at least 4 days out. Until then, we need to stay vigilant." As the meeting broke up, Matt turned to Margaret. "I'm on the midnight to 8 shift at the jail tomorrow night," he said quietly. "But I'd like to check on you when I can." "I'll be fine," Margaret assured him, touched by his concern. Mrs. Holloway is talking about moving her bed downstairs and having us all sleep in the parlor for a few days. Matt nodded approvingly. Good thinking, harder to surprise a group altogether. He glanced toward the front of the room where Sheriff Daniels was still talking with a group of men. I should go get my assignment details. Can I see you home first, please? Margaret said, suddenly not wanting to walk the darkened streets alone. Outside, the night was clear and cool, stars speckling the black sky in a way Margaret had never seen in Boston. Under different circumstances, it would have been a beautiful evening for a stroll. You're quiet, Matt observed as they walked. Just thinking, Margaret replied. When I decided to come west, I expected certain hardships. Primitive conditions, harsh weather, isolation. I didn't expect to be hiding from outlaws within my first month. Matt chuckled softly. The West isn't for the faint of heart, that's certain. I'm not faint of heart, Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. Just adjusting my expectations. They had reached the boarding house. Light spilled from the windows and Margaret could see Mrs. Holloway moving about inside, probably preparing for their makeshift dormitory arrangement. Margaret, Matt said suddenly, his voice low and serious. If things go bad, if the Blackwells do come, promise me you'll stay hidden. Don't try to be brave. The intensity in his blue eyes caught her off guard. I promise, she said softly, but you must promise me something in return. What's that? Be careful at the jail. Don't try to be a hero. A slow smile spread across Matt's face. Are you worried about me, schoolteacher? Someone should be, Margaret replied tartly, since you seem determined to put yourself in harm's way. Matt's smile faded. I've been in this territory for 15 years, seen too many good communities destroyed by men like the Blackwells. I won't let that happen to Redemption Springs. The simple declaration, spoken with such quiet conviction, stirred something in Margaret's heart. This man, with his rough exterior and questionable reputation, had a depth of character she was only beginning to glimpse. Good night, Matt, she said, impulsively touching his arm. Thank you for escorting me. Good night, Margaret, he replied, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. Sweet dreams. As she watched him walk away, Margaret wondered if sweet dreams were possible with the threat of the Blackwell gang hanging over the town like a storm cloud. But as she turned to enter the boarding house, she realized that despite everything, she felt safer knowing Matt Riley was standing watch. The next 2 days passed in a state of nervous anticipation. The town continued its business, stores opened, meals were cooked, children attended school, but with an underlying tension that manifested in extra glances toward the horizon and hushed conversations that stopped when the children came near. Margaret kept her classroom routine as normal as possible, though she noticed several empty seats. Some parents had decided to keep their children at home or had even temporarily relocated to stay with relatives in safer towns. On Sunday morning, the church was packed, everyone seeking comfort in faith and community. Reverend Howard delivered a sermon on courage and trust in God's protection that left few dry eyes in the congregation. Margaret sat with Mrs. Holloway and Mr. Perkins, but she found her gaze repeatedly drawn to where Matt sat with several other ranch hands near the back. After the service, people lingered in the churchyard, reluctant to disperse. Margaret was speaking with Mrs. Peterson about the supplies for the safe houses when she noticed Matt approaching. Miss Winters, he said formally, tipping his hat. Mrs. Peterson. Mr. Riley, Mrs. Peterson acknowledged with a nod that was slightly warmer than her usual greeting. The crisis had apparently softened her attitude toward the cowboy. Any news? Margaret asked quietly. Matt shook his head. Nothing definite. Sheriff rode out at dawn to scout, but he hasn't returned yet. A tense silence fell over the small group. Finally, Mrs. Peterson sighed. Well, standing around worrying won't help. Miss Winters, shall we check the supplies at the school one more time? It's designated as one of the safe houses. Margaret nodded, relieved to have something constructive to do. Of course, Mr. Riley, will you excuse us? Actually, Matt said, clearing his throat, I was hoping I might walk with you. I'm headed in that direction anyway. Mrs. Peterson's eyebrows rose slightly, but she merely said, by all means, Mr. Riley. An escort is always welcome these days. As they walked toward the schoolhouse, Margaret was acutely aware of Matt beside her. He seemed more restless than usual, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "You're on edge," she observed quietly. Matt glanced at her. "Let's just say I've got a feeling, been too quiet." "Isn't quiet good?" Mrs. Peterson asked. "Not always, madam," Matt replied grimly. "Sometimes it's just the calm before the storm." They reached the schoolhouse and went inside, Margaret and Mrs. Peterson began checking the supplies: barrels of water, crates of preserved food, blankets, and a small medical kit that Doc Wallace had prepared. Matt prowled the perimeter of the room, checking windows and the sturdiness of the door. "This building's solid enough," he commented. "Good thick walls. But those windows are a weakness." "We can't board up the school on a hunch, Mr. Riley," Mrs. Peterson said, though her tone was concerned rather than dismissive. "No, madam, I suppose not," Matt agreed. He turned to Margaret. "You teaching tomorrow?" Margaret hesitated. "I plan to. Though I expect attendance will be low." Matt frowned but said nothing. His attention suddenly shifted to the window. "Rider coming. Fast." Margaret and Mrs. Peterson moved to look out. A man on horseback was galloping down the main street, heading for the sheriff's office. Even at a distance, the urgency in his posture was clear. "That's Tom Wallace, the doctor's son," Mrs. Peterson said. "He helps with the patrols." Without a word, Matt strode to the door. "Stay here," he ordered. "I'll find out what's happening." Before either woman could respond, he was gone, moving with the swift, ground-eating stride of a man accustomed to covering long distances on foot. Margaret and Mrs. Peterson looked at each other, fear mirrored in both their faces. "I think, Mrs. Peterson said slowly, "we should finish checking these supplies very thoroughly, Miss Winters, just in case." Margaret nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. "Yes, I think that would be wise." They worked in tense silence for the next 20 minutes, both straining to hear any commotion from the direction of the sheriff's office. Finally, they heard the unmistakable sound of a horse trotting down the street. Mrs. Peterson reached the window first. "It's Mayor Peterson," she said, relief evident in her voice. "And Mr. Riley is with him." They went to the door, stepping out onto the schoolhouse porch as the two men approached. "Albert, what's happening?" Mrs. Peterson demanded as soon as they were within earshot. The mayor's face was grim. "Tom Wallace spotted 3 riders about 5 miles out, heading this way. One matches the description of Luke Blackwell." Margaret felt her heart constrict. "Are you certain?" "As certain as we can be without waiting for them to introduce themselves," Matt said, his voice tight with tension. "Sheriff's organizing the men now." "What should we do?" Margaret asked. "Get to one of the safe houses," Mayor Peterson said firmly. "The hotel would be best. It's the most secure building in town besides the jail." "I need to warn Mrs. Holloway and Mr. Perkins," Margaret said, already moving toward the street. Matt caught her arm. "I'll come with you." "No," Mayor Peterson said sharply. "We need every able man, Riley. The women can look after themselves for now." Matt's jaw tightened, but after a moment he nodded. "Be careful," he said to Margaret, his eyes intense. "Get to the hotel as quick as you can, no delays." "I will," she promised. "You be careful, too." With a quick squeeze of her hand, Matt turned and followed the mayor toward the sheriff's office, leaving Margaret and Mrs. Peterson to hurry toward the boarding house. "He cares for you," Mrs. Peterson observed as they walked rapidly down the street. "He's concerned for everyone's safety," Margaret replied, not meeting the older woman's knowing gaze. "Indeed," Mrs. Peterson said dryly. "Though I notice he wasn't holding my hand." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks but was saved from responding by their arrival at the boarding house. Mrs. Holloway was already packing a basket with food and necessities. "Thank the Lord you're here," she exclaimed when they entered. "Mr. Perkins has gone to help at the livery. They're moving the horses to the back corral where they'll be less likely to panic if there's shooting." "We need to get to the hotel," Mrs. Peterson said firmly. "Mayor's orders. Is there anything else essential we need to take?" Within 15 minutes, the 3 women were hurrying toward the hotel, each carrying a small bundle of necessities. The streets were eerily quiet, most civilians having already sought shelter. Near the bank, a group of men were piling sandbags in front of the windows. Another group was visible on the roof of the general store, rifles at the ready. At the hotel, they found nearly 20 women and children already gathered in the large dining room. Tables had been pushed against the walls and blankets were spread on the floor for the younger children. The hotel owner's wife, Mrs. Jenkins, was organizing everyone with brisk efficiency. "Find yourselves a spot," she directed the newcomers. "We might be here a while." Margaret helped Mrs. Holloway and Mrs. Peterson settle in, then found herself drawn to the window. From this vantage point, she could see part of the main street. Men with rifles were positioned strategically behind barrels, wagons, and on rooftops. "Miss Winters," Mrs. Jenkins called, "could you help with the children? Some of the little ones are frightened." Grateful for the distraction, Margaret moved to where several children were huddled together, wide-eyed and silent. She recognized most of them from her school. "Who would like to hear a story?" she asked, forcing brightness into her voice. A few small hands raised hesitantly. Margaret sat on the floor and gathered the youngest children around her, launching into a tale about a clever rabbit who outsmarted a fox. The story had barely reached its midpoint when the first gunshot rang out. The children froze, some beginning to whimper. Margaret pulled them closer. "It's all right," she soothed, though her own heart was racing. "We're safe here." More shots followed, a ragged pattern that suggested multiple shooters. Through the window, Margaret could see puffs of smoke rising from various positions along the street. The battle for Redemption Springs had begun. For what seemed like hours but was probably less than 30 minutes, the gunfire continued sporadically. The women and children huddled together, some praying, others trying to comfort the youngest. Margaret found herself thinking of Matt, wondering where he was positioned, if he was safe. Suddenly, a man burst through the hotel door, bleeding from a graze on his temple. "They're heading for the jail," he gasped. "3 of them trying to free their partner." Several women cried out in alarm. Margaret felt her blood run cold. The jail where Matt had volunteered to stand guard. Without conscious thought, she rose to her feet and moved toward the door. "Miss Winters," Mrs. Holloway exclaimed. "What are you doing?" Margaret hesitated, one hand on the doorknob. What was she doing? She had no weapon, no fighting skills. What could she possibly hope to accomplish? I need to see," she said finally. "I can't just sit here not knowing." Before anyone could stop her, she slipped out the door and into the hotel's narrow back hallway. There was a side entrance that should allow her to see the jail without exposing herself to the main street. The hotel was eerily silent compared to the dining room full of women and children. Margaret moved cautiously through the kitchen and out the service door into a small alley. From here, she could work her way around to a position where she might glimpse the jail without being seen. The gunfire had intensified, now focused around the jail building at the end of the main street. Margaret pressed herself against the wall of the general store, peering cautiously around the corner. What she saw made her blood freeze. The jail was under heavy fire, bullets splintering the wooden facade. Several defenders were returning fire from behind overturned wagons, but they were clearly outnumbered. And there, crouched behind a water trough directly in front of the jail, was Matt, his rifle aimed steadily at one of the attackers. As Margaret watched in horror, one of the outlaws moved to a new position, getting a clearer angle on Matt's location. He raised his pistol, taking careful aim. Without thinking, Margaret grabbed a discarded tin bucket from the alley and threw it with all her might against the side of the building. The resulting clatter was loud enough to startle the outlaw, causing his shot to go wide. Matt, alerted by the noise, quickly changed position, firing back at his would-be killer. Margaret's relief was short-lived. Her distraction had drawn attention, and now one of the outlaws was turning toward the alley where she stood. Heart pounding, she turned and ran, not back toward the hotel, but toward the only other place she could think of that might offer sanctuary: the church. It stood just across the side street, its solid stone walls promising protection. She heard a shout behind her, then the terrifying sound of footsteps in pursuit. Gathering her skirts, Margaret ran faster than she ever had in her life, her breath coming in desperate gasps. The church door was unlocked. Reverend Howard always left it open for those seeking prayer or refuge. Margaret slipped inside, closing the heavy door behind her as quietly as possible. The interior was dim, lit only by the colored light filtering through the stained glass windows. Where to hide? The nave was too exposed, the vestry perhaps, but no, too obvious. Then she remembered the small storage area behind the altar where communion supplies and extra hymnals were kept. Moving as silently as possible, Margaret made her way to the front of the church and slipped behind the altar. The storage area was little more than a closet, separated from the main church by a wooden door. Margaret squeezed inside and pulled the door nearly closed, leaving just enough space to see through. For several agonizing minutes, there was no sound except her own ragged breathing, which she tried desperately to quiet. Had she lost her pursuer, or was he searching elsewhere? Then came the unmistakable creak of the church's front door opening. Heavy footsteps moved slowly up the center aisle. Margaret pressed deeper into her hiding place, praying the dim light would conceal the partially open door. Come out, wherever you are," a rough voice called mockingly. "I know you're in here, lady, saw you run in." Margaret held her breath, pressing her fist against her mouth to prevent any sound from escaping. The footsteps moved closer, stopping near the altar. "Playing hard to get, huh?" the voice continued. "That's fine, I got time." A crashing sound suggested he was overturning the altar. Margaret closed her eyes, certain she would be discovered at any moment. Suddenly, there was another sound, the church door opening again. The footsteps paused. "Luke, that you?" the outlaw called. Instead of an answer, there was the distinctive sound of a gun being cocked. "Step away from the altar," a familiar voice commanded. "Now, Matt," Margaret nearly sagged with relief. "Well, if it ain't the hero Cowboy," the outlaw sneered. "Come to save the lady," I said. "Step away," Matt repeated, his voice cold as iron. There was a tense pause, then the sound of movement. "All right, Cowboy, take it easy, I'm stepping back." "Drop your gun, kick it toward me," a clatter as metal hit the wooden floor, then a sliding sound. "Now turn around, hands where I can see them." More shuffling sounds. Margaret dared to peek through the crack in the door. She could see Matt standing in the center aisle, his revolver trained on the outlaw, whose back was now to the altar. "The lady worth dying for, Cowboy?" the outlaw asked, his hands raised but his posture still defiant. "She's not the one about to die," Matt replied evenly. "Now, we're going to walk out of here nice and slow. You try anything, you'll be meeting your maker a lot sooner than planned." The outlaw laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the quiet church. "You think this is over?" "Luke Blackwell doesn't leave men behind. He'll burn this whole town to the ground before he leaves without his brother." "Maybe," Matt acknowledged, "but you won't be around to see it. Move." As they began to move toward the door, the outlaw suddenly lunged to the side, drawing a hidden knife from his boot. Matt fired, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The outlaw staggered, clutching his shoulder, but still came forward with the knife. Matt fired again. This time the outlaw went down and stayed down. For a moment there was absolute silence. Then Matt called out, "Margaret, are you in here?" Trembling, Margaret pushed open the closet door and stepped out from behind the altar. "I'm here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Matt's face showed a mixture of relief and anger. "What in God's name were you thinking, leaving the hotel? You could have been killed." "I had to know if you were safe," Margaret said simply, too shaken to dissemble. "I saw you at the jail, and then that man was about to shoot you." Understanding dawned on Matt's face. "The distraction, that was you." When Margaret nodded, his expression softened. "You saved my life and nearly lost your own doing it." He holstered his gun and crossed to her in 3 long strides, pulling her into a fierce embrace. Margaret stiffened in surprise, then melted against him, the fear and tension of the past hours dissolving into relief at the solid warmth of him. "I thought I'd lost you," Matt murmured against her hair, "when I saw him chasing you toward the church." Margaret pulled back slightly to look up at him. "You followed him?" "I wasn't about to let him hurt you," Matt said simply. "Not after what you did." Their eyes held for a long moment. Something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither had been ready to admit until this moment of crisis. The sound of gunfire outside broke the spell. Matt released her reluctantly. "It's not over," he said, moving toward the church door. "Stay behind me." We need to get you somewhere safe." "What about him?" Margaret asked, glancing at the fallen outlaw. "He's not going anywhere," Matt said grimly. "Sheriff can deal with him later." He cracked open the church door and peered out. "Looks clear. We're going to make a run for it back to the hotel." "Ready?" Margaret nodded, gathering her skirts in preparation. "Ready," Matt took her hand. "Stay close." They slipped out of the church and moved rapidly along the side street, keeping to the shadows of the buildings. The gunfire seemed to be concentrated at the far end of town now. As they neared the hotel, Matt suddenly pulled Margaret into a recessed doorway. "Wait," he whispered, peering around the corner. "Someone's coming." They pressed back into the shadows as a figure moved stealthily down the alley toward them. Matt's hand moved to his gun. "Matt, that you?" A voice called softly. "Tom," Matt responded, recognizing the doctor's son. "What's happening?" Tom Wallace appeared at the corner, his young face streaked with dirt and sweat. "It's over," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Sheriff got Luke Blackwell." Other ones surrendered when he saw Luke go down. Margaret sagged against Matt, the tension draining from her body. "Thank God," she whispered. "Anyone hurt on our side?" Matt asked. "Mayor took a bullet in the leg, but Doc says he'll be fine. Few others with minor injuries." Tom nodded toward the church. "What about you? Heard shots." "One of them followed Miss Winters to the church," Matt explained. "He won't be bothering anyone again." Tom's eyes widened as he noticed Margaret for the first time. "Miss Winters, what were you doing out here?" "It's a long story," Matt said before Margaret could answer. "Let's get her back to the hotel first." As they emerged onto the main street, they could see townsfolk beginning to venture out, looking shell-shocked but relieved. The sheriff and several deputies were visible down by the jail. Surrounding a man with his hands bound the surrendered outlaw. At the hotel, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Women were crying with relief, children were being comforted, and a makeshift medical station had been set up in one corner where Doc Wallace was tending to the injured. "Margaret," Mrs. Holloway cried, rushing forward as they entered. "Thank the Lord you're safe. We've been frantic with worry." "I'm fine," Margaret assured her, accepting the older woman's embrace. "Thanks to Mr. Riley." Mrs. Holloway turned to Matt, and for once there was no disapproval in her gaze. "Thank you for bringing her back safely, Mr. Riley." Matt touched the brim of his hat. "Just doing what needed doing, madam." Over the next hours, the story of the showdown with the Blackwell gang was pieced together from various accounts. Luke Blackwell and one of his men had been killed in the fighting. Another was dead in the church, and the fourth had surrendered. Their prisoner remained secure in the jail. The town of Redemption Springs had stood its ground and prevailed. As the excitement gradually subsided, Margaret found herself sitting on the hotel's front porch, watching as the sun began to set. The events of the day seemed almost dreamlike now: the terror, the desperate flight to the church, Matt's timely arrival. "Mind if I join you?" Matt's voice broke into her thoughts. Margaret looked up with a smile. "Please do." He settled onto the step beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. For a few minutes, they sat in companionable silence, watching the golden light of sunset paint the dusty main street. "Sheriff asked me to ride with the posse taking the prisoners to the territorial capital," Matt said finally. "We leave tomorrow morning." Margaret felt a pang of disappointment. "How long will you be gone?" "Week, maybe 10 days, he glanced at her. "Will you still be here when I get back?" The question held more than casual interest, and they both knew it. "Where else would I be?" Margaret asked softly. "I came west to teach. That hasn't changed." Matt nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Good, that's good." Another silence fell between them, this one charged with unspoken emotions. "Matt," Margaret began hesitantly, "about what happened in the church." "Which part?" he asked, a hint of a smile playing around his mouth. "The part where you hid from an outlaw, or the part where I held you like I never wanted to let go?" Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. "The latter, I suppose." Matt turned to face her fully. "I meant it, Margaret, when I thought I might lose you." He shook his head. "It made a lot of things clear." "What things?" Margaret asked, her heart beating faster. "That I care for you, more than I should maybe, given how short a time we've known each other." His blue eyes held her steadily. "But life out here doesn't always give us the luxury of time." Margaret nodded, understanding all too well after the day's events. "I care for you too," she admitted. "Though Mrs. Holloway would probably say I'm being reckless," Matt chuckled. "Mrs. Holloway might be changing her mind about me. She actually thanked me earlier without looking like she'd bitten into a lemon." Margaret laughed, the sound carrying away some of the day's tension. "Progress indeed." Matt's expression grew serious again. "I don't want to rush you, Margaret. You came west to teach, not to find a husband." "I respect that, but when I get back—" He hesitated. "I'd like to court you properly, if you're willing." The simple, honest declaration touched Margaret deeply. This was no flowery profession of undying love, but something more real, a man offering his heart with the same straightforward manner with which he approached everything else. "I think," Margaret said slowly, "that I would like that very much." The smile that spread across Matt's face was like the sunrise, warm and full of promise. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her lips. It was brief, almost chaste, but it sealed a promise between them as surely as any formal declaration. When they parted, both were smiling. "I should get you back to Mrs. Holloway's," Matt said, rising and offering his hand. "Before she decides I'm a bad influence again." Margaret took his hand and stood. "I think today has proven that I'm perfectly capable of finding trouble on my own, Mr. Riley." Matt laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "True enough, Miss Winters, true enough." As they walked hand in hand through the twilight streets of Redemption Springs, Margaret reflected on the strange path that had led her here from the sheltered drawing rooms of Boston to a frontier town that had just fought off a gang of outlaws. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but as she glanced at the tall cowboy beside her, she couldn't imagine wanting any other. The following morning dawned clear and cool. Margaret rose early, determined to see Matt off with the posse despite Mrs. Holloway's raised eyebrows. The town was already returning to its normal rhythm, though evidence of the previous day's battle remained in splintered wood and broken windows. At the sheriff's office, a small crowd had gathered to watch the prisoners being loaded into a reinforced wagon. Sheriff Daniels, his arm still in a sling but his badge gleaming on his chest, was giving final instructions to the 6 men who would form the escort. Margaret spotted Matt immediately, checking the cinch on his saddle, his rifle secured in its scabbard. He looked up as she approached, his face lighting up with a smile that made her heart skip. "Didn't expect to see you here so early," he said, stepping away from his horse. "I wanted to wish you safe travels," Margaret replied. 10 days is a long time," Matt's expression softened. "It is at that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn book. "Thought you might like this while I'm gone. It's not much, but—" Margaret took the offering, a slim volume of poetry by Tennyson. "It's perfect," she said, genuinely touched. "I'll read it every day until you return. Mount up, men." Sheriff Daniels called. "We're burning daylight." Matt hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave. "Margaret, I know," she interrupted gently. "Me too. Now go before the sheriff comes looking for you." With a quick squeeze of her hand, Matt turned and mounted his horse. As the posse rode out of town, he looked back once, raising his hand in farewell. Margaret waved back, holding the book of poetry close to her heart. The days that followed fell into a new pattern. Margaret taught her classes, now fully attended again as life in Redemption Springs returned to normal. In the evenings, she would read from Matt's book of poetry, wondering where he was and if he was safe. To her surprise, Mrs. Holloway's attitude toward Matt seemed to have undergone a dramatic shift. She now spoke of him with reluctant respect, acknowledging that his actions during the Blackwell gang incident had shown his true character. "Not that I approve of everything about the man," she said one evening as she and Margaret sat on the porch. "He's still too wild by half, but his heart's in the right place, I'll grant him that." "High praise indeed, Mrs. Holloway," Margaret teased gently. The older woman sniffed. "Don't get above yourself, young lady. I still say a schoolteacher should set an example of propriety." "And what would be more proper than being courted by a respectable rancher?" Margaret countered, enjoying the rare opportunity to get the better of her landlady. Mrs. Holloway's eyebrows shot up. "Rancher? I thought Riley was just a hired hand at the Lazy R," He was, Margaret confirmed. But he told me before he left that he's been saving to buy his own place. He's got his eye on the old Jenkins property north of town. Well, Mrs. Holloway said, clearly reassessing her opinion yet again. That does put a different complexion on things. 9 days after the posse's departure, Margaret was just dismissing her class when one of the older boys burst back through the door. "Riders coming, Miss Winters." Might be the posse returning. Margaret's heart leaped. She hastily gathered her things and followed the excited children out onto the schoolhouse steps. Down the main street, a group of riders was indeed approaching, dust rising from their horses' hooves in the late afternoon sun. As they drew closer, Margaret scanned the group anxiously, relief flooding through her when she spotted Matt's familiar figure. He rode tall in the saddle despite what must have been an exhausting journey, his face bronzed by the sun and wind. The townspeople emerged from shops and houses to welcome the returning men. Sheriff Daniels led the way, raising his hat to acknowledge the cheers. The wagon with the prisoners rolled toward the jail, flanked by 2 riders. Matt broke away from the group, guiding his horse directly to where Margaret stood. He dismounted in one fluid motion, removing his hat as he approached her. "Miss Winters," he said formally, though his eyes held a warmth that was anything but distant. "We've returned a day early." "So I see, Mr. Riley," Margaret replied, equally formal though she couldn't keep the smile from her face. "I trust your journey was successful. The prisoners are safely delivered to territorial authorities," Matt confirmed. "And I've some personal business that concluded satisfactorily as well." Before Margaret could inquire further, Mrs. Peterson appeared at her elbow. "Mr. Riley, welcome back. You must join us for dinner this evening. The mayor is hosting a small gathering to thank the posse members." Matt glanced at Margaret, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly. "I'd be honored, Mrs. Peterson," he said, returning his hat to his head. "If you'll excuse me, I need to see to my horse. Miss Winters, perhaps I could call on you tomorrow, say around noon." "I'd like that," Margaret said, suddenly shy under the interested gazes of the townspeople who were pretending not to watch this exchange. With a tip of his hat, Matt led his horse toward the livery stable, leaving Margaret to fend off Mrs. Peterson's knowing looks and pointed questions. The next day dawned bright and clear, a perfect October Sunday. Church service was well attended, with Reverend Howard giving thanks for the town's deliverance from the Blackwell gang. Margaret sat with Mrs. Holloway as usual, but she was acutely aware of Matt's presence several pews behind them. After the service, he approached her in the churchyard. "Still all right if I call on you at noon?" he asked. "Of course," Margaret replied. "Mrs. Holloway is preparing a Sunday roast." Matt smiled. "Actually, I was hoping to take you on a short ride. There's something I'd like to show you." Margaret hesitated. "A ride? Nothing improper," Matt assured her quickly. "Just a place not far from town. We'd be back well before dark." "In that case, I'd be delighted," Margaret decided. "I'll change into something more suitable for riding." At precisely noon, Matt arrived at the boarding house with 2 horses, his own sturdy chestnut gelding, and a gentle-looking gray mare. Mrs. Holloway watched from the porch with an expression that suggested she was reserving judgment on this expedition. "Have her back by supper time, Mr. Riley," she instructed as Margaret mounted the gray mare with Matt's assistance. "Yes, madam," Matt replied solemnly. "You have my word." They rode north out of town, following a well-worn trail that wound through stands of cottonwood trees and across open grassland. The day was perfect for riding, warm enough to be comfortable, but with a crispness to the air that hinted at the approaching winter. "Where are we going?" Margaret asked as they rode side by side. "It's a surprise," Matt replied with a smile, "but we're almost there." They crested a small rise and Matt reined in his horse. "There," he said, pointing ahead. "What do you think?" Margaret followed his gesture and saw a small valley spread out before them. A creek wound through its center, bordered by cottonwoods and willows. On a slight rise overlooking the water stood a modest cabin with a barn and corral nearby. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, suggesting someone was in residence. "It's lovely," Margaret said sincerely. "Whose place is this?" Matt's smile widened. "Mine, as of yesterday." Margaret turned to him in surprise. Yours, but I thought you were interested in the Jenkins property. That was the story we put about, Matt explained. I've been negotiating for this place for months, but I didn't want to say anything until it was certain. He gestured toward the cabin. It's not much yet, just 40 acres, the cabin, and enough pasture for a small herd. But it's a start. Understanding dawned on Margaret. This is the personal business you mentioned yesterday. Matt nodded, suddenly looking uncharacteristically nervous. I wanted to have something of my own before. He trailed off, then straightened his shoulders. Before I asked you a very important question, Margaret's heart began to race. Matt, let me show you the place first, he said quickly. Then we can talk. They rode down into the valley and dismounted near the cabin. Up close, Margaret could see that it was small but solidly built, with a covered porch across the front and glass windows, a luxury on the frontier. Previous owner was a craftsman, Matt explained as he helped her down from her horse. Built it with his own hands, inside's basic but sound. He led her up the steps and opened the door. The interior was indeed simple, one main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and 2 doors that presumably led to bedrooms. But it was clean and well made, with tight-fitting logs and a plank floor. It needs a woman's touch, Matt said, watching her reaction carefully. Curtains, rugs, that sort of thing. Margaret turned slowly, taking it all in. It's wonderful, Matt, a perfect start for a ranch. Relief crossed his face. You really think so? I do, she said honestly. You should be proud. Matt cleared his throat. I was hoping, that is, I wanted to ask. He stopped, took a deep breath, and started again. Margaret, I know we haven't known each other long, but I think we've seen the best and worst of each other in that time. He took her hands in his. When I saw you in danger, I realized I couldn't imagine my life without you in it. I don't want to imagine it. Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes as Matt continued. I'm not a man of fancy words, he said. But I love you, Margaret Winters. I love your courage and your kindness and the way you stand up for what you believe in. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me. Slowly, he knelt before her, still holding her hands. Will you marry me, be my wife, share this land with me, build something lasting together? The tears spilled over as Margaret nodded. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes, Matt, I will marry you. Joy transformed his face as he rose to his feet and pulled her into his arms. This kiss was different from their first, deeper, filled with promise and passion, only partially restrained. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless and smiling. I have something for you, Matt said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small silver ring set with a modest pearl. It was my mother's. I've carried it with me since she passed, waiting for the right woman to give it to. As he slipped it onto her finger, Margaret felt a sense of rightness, of coming home. It's beautiful, she said softly. I'll treasure it always. They spent the next hour walking the property, Matt pointing out his plans for expanding the cabin, building a larger barn, and gradually increasing his herd. Margaret found herself caught up in his enthusiasm, offering suggestions and sharing her own dreams. I want to keep teaching, she said as they stood by the creek. At least for a while, the children need education and I love the work. I wouldn't ask you to give it up, Matt assured her. Town's only a short ride away. You could teach during the day and come home in the evenings. Home. The word had never sounded so sweet. When? Margaret asked suddenly. When should we marry? Matt smiled. Whenever you want. Tomorrow wouldn't be soon enough for me, but I reckon Mrs. Holloway would have something to say about that. Margaret laughed. As would Reverend Howard. But I don't want to wait too long. Christmas, Matt suggested. That gives us 2 months to prepare and to get the cabin ready for a bride. Christmas would be perfect, Margaret agreed. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they reluctantly mounted their horses for the ride back to town. Margaret's mind was already spinning with plans and details: her dress, the ceremony, what to write to her few remaining family members in Boston. What are you thinking? Matt asked as they rode side by side. That life takes unexpected turns, Margaret replied. 3 months ago, I was a spinster schoolteacher in Boston, convinced that adventure and love had passed me by. Now I'm engaged to a cowboy in Arizona territory. Matt chuckled. Does that frighten you? Not anymore, Margaret said, reaching across to touch his arm. Not with you. The news of their engagement spread through Redemption Springs like wildfire. By the time they reached the boarding house, Mrs. Holloway was waiting on the porch, having already been informed by Mrs. Peterson, who had heard it from the blacksmith's wife, who had seen them riding out of town together. To Margaret's surprise, Mrs. Holloway embraced her warmly. "I'm happy for you, dear," she said, "though I'll miss having you under my roof." "Not until Christmas," Margaret reminded her. "And we'll still be neighbors." The next 2 months passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Margaret continued teaching, but her evenings and weekends were filled with wedding plans and readying the cabin for her arrival. The women of the town rallied around her, helping to sew curtains, braiding rugs, and assembling a proper trousseau. Matt worked equally hard, adding a lean-to kitchen to the cabin, building proper furniture, and purchasing the beginnings of his cattle herd 20 head of sturdy longhorns that would form the foundation of the Riley Ranch. By mid-December, Redemption Springs was transformed by the approaching holiday and wedding. Evergreen boughs decorated the church and many of the businesses along Main Street. The school children were practicing carols for a Christmas Eve performance, and excitement filled the air. On the day before Christmas Eve, their wedding day, Margaret stood in Mrs. Holloway's best guest room, where her wedding dress was laid out on the bed. It was a creation of ivory silk, ordered from a dressmaker in Tucson and altered by the women of Redemption Springs to fit Margaret perfectly. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Holloway said, helping Margaret with the tiny buttons down the back of the dress. "Like a proper bride." Margaret smiled at her reflection in the looking glass. The dress was simpler than what she might have worn for a Boston wedding, but it suited her new life, perfectly elegant but practical, with a modestly scooped neckline and sleeves that ended just below her elbows. "I can hardly believe this is happening," Margaret confessed. "It all seems like a dream." "The best kind of dream," Mrs. Holloway said, unexpectedly sentimental, "the kind that comes true." The church was filled to capacity when Margaret arrived on the arm of Mayor Peterson, who had offered to give her away in the absence of her father. Candles and evergreen boughs transformed the simple space into something magical, their scent filling the air with the promise of new beginnings. And there at the altar stood Matt, looking so handsome in his new suit that Margaret's breath caught in her throat. His face when he saw her walking down the aisle held such love and wonder that tears sprang to her eyes. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Margaret remembered the warmth of Matt's hands holding hers, the steady certainty in his voice as he spoke his vows, the weight of the gold band as he slipped it onto her finger to join her mother's pearl. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Howard declared. "You may kiss your bride." As Matt's lips met hers, sealing their union before God and the community that had become her family, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world not in the refined drawing rooms of Boston, but here in this frontier town, with this man who had found her hiding behind a church door and shown her the way to a life filled with love and purpose. The celebration afterward filled the hotel dining room with laughter, music, and more food than Margaret had ever seen in one place. Everyone in town seemed determined to ensure that the new Mrs. Riley began her married life with proper festivity. As the evening wore on, Matt leaned close to her. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Riley?" The words sent a thrill through her. "Yes," she whispered. "I'm ready." They slipped away amid good-natured teasing and well wishes, climbing into the wagon Matt had decorated with evergreen boughs for the occasion. As they drove through the moonlit night toward their cabin, their home, Margaret nestled against her husband's side, content in a way she had never imagined possible. "Happy?" Matt asked, his arm secure around her shoulders. "More than I can say," Margaret replied. "And you?" "Happiest man in the territory," he declared, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And the luckiest." When they reached the cabin, Matt insisted on carrying her across the threshold, making her laugh with delight. Inside, a fire burned welcomingly in the fireplace, casting a golden glow over the simple furnishings that now included touches of Margaret's influence: curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on the rocking chair, books arranged on newly built shelves. That night they discovered each other as husband and wife, their love expressed in the most intimate way possible. And afterward, as Margaret lay in Matt's arms, watching the firelight play across the ceiling of their bedroom, she thought about the strange path that had led her here. "What are you thinking?" Matt asked sleepily, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "About hiding behind that church door," Margaret said, "and how frightened I was." Matt pulled her closer. "And now?" "Now I'm not afraid of anything," she said, pressing a kiss to his chest, right over his heart. "Not with you beside me." The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. The Riley ranch grew steadily, as did their family. Their first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth, arrived the following November, followed 2 years later by a son they called James. Margaret continued teaching until Elizabeth was born, then focused on raising their children and helping with the ranch. But she never lost her passion for education, eventually starting a small school in their home for the children of neighboring ranchers. Redemption Springs prospered and grew as the territory moved toward statehood. The Blackwell Gang became a distant memory, a story told to wide-eyed children about the time their town stood up to outlaws and won. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Matt surprised Margaret with an addition to the cabin, a proper library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a large desk where she could write and teach. "For the smartest rancher's wife in Arizona," he said as he showed her the room. "And the best mother our children could ask for." Margaret, deeply touched by his understanding of her continued need for intellectual stimulation, threw her arms around him. "Have I told you today how much I love you, Matthew Riley?" "You have," he said, kissing her soundly. "But I never tire of hearing it." 10 years after their wedding, on a crisp December morning much like the day they were married, Matt and Margaret stood on the porch of their now expanded home, watching their children play in the first light snowfall of the season. The ranch had prospered beyond their early dreams, the herd now numbered over 200 head, and the original cabin had been expanded into a comfortable family home. "Did you ever imagine this?" Margaret asked, leaning against her husband's solid strength. "That day when you found me hiding behind the church door," Matt looked down at her, the love in his eyes undimmed by the passing years. "I knew you were special from the moment I saw you," he said. "But this," he gestured to their home, their land, their children. "This is better than anything I could have imagined." "It's safe to step out now," Margaret quoted softly, remembering his words from that fateful day. "You were right. It was safe to step out of my old life and into this one with you." Matt pulled her close, his arms still as strong and secure as they had been a decade earlier. "Best thing you ever did, Mrs. Riley," he murmured against her hair. "Best thing for both of us." As their children's laughter filled the clear winter air, Margaret silently agreed. From that moment of terror behind the church door had come the greatest blessing of her life, the courage to embrace love and build a life in this wild, beautiful land with the man who had become her heart's true home.